It was a decision worthy of Solomon, but it landed on my 12-year-old lap. Should I fail English, or should I throw Mrs. Flukiger under the bus? Mrs. Flukiger was the children's librarian at Syosset Library and the most magical adult I'd ever encountered. She wore white blouses with Peter Pan collars and flouncy skirts and had straight black hair that hugged her head like a bowl. She looked like she never completely grew up. I figured a life among kids' books could have that effect. But the most wondrous thing about Mrs. Flukiger was her recommendations. She knew exactly what each kid would want to read. The books she selected for me always revolved around a quiet, well-behaved schoolgirl who asserted her independence to rescue someone in need. It was the kind of heroine I longed to be. That spring, my English class studied journalism. Our teacher, Mr. Feinstein, thought investigative reporters were the noblest of people, and he urged us to pursue truth at any cost. Our final project was to interview someone we admired. Of course, I chose Mrs. Flukiger. Also around this time, my mother began working as a library assistant. One evening, I overheard her tell my dad about a tiff at work. A patron had asked Mrs. Flukiger for the Nancy Drew section, and Mrs. Flukiger had said there wasn't any. "Those books are junk," she told the woman. "I don't carry junk." My mom sounded amused by the incident, but it stopped me cold. I'd read some Nancy Drews we owned at home, and they were very nice books. Nancy was smart and determined, as in The Hidden Staircase, where she stumbled through a trapdoor, landed in the pitch-black cellar, squeezed through a narrow passageway, and armed only with a flashlight, discovered the secret staircase that revealed the burglar who had terrorized the two elderly widows. Why was that junk? And more important, why was Mrs. Flukiger banning books anyway? Mr. Feinstein would tell me to call her out. But no, I thought, Mrs. Flukiger was someone I loved. Could I actually accuse her of censorship and make her look bad? On the other hand, could I brush this off? Would Woodward and Bernstein let her off the hook? What was I going to do? Still unsure, I arrived at her office on interview day and started down my list of questions. Where did she grow up? Brooklyn, she answered. Why did she become a children's librarian? She was passionate about reading. How did she choose which books to carry, and were there any she wouldn't? I held my breath, hoping I'd misunderstood my mother. No such luck. I don't carry junk, she said, like Nancy Drew. That's junk. A slew of follow-up questions aligned in my mind like well-trained soldiers. What made those books junk? What criteria did she use? What if kids wanted them anyway? Was censorship ever okay? I opened my mouth and tried, but it wasn't happening. I didn't have the stomach to put Mrs. Flukiger on the spot. I simply wrote, "No junk," in my notebook. Then I asked another question. 2 days later, I submitted my paper, and when Mr. Feinstein returned it, he jabbed his finger at that word, junk. "Why didn't you press her?" he said. "You missed the whole story." I nodded and looked for the F. He had been kind, B-, but it was the lowest grade I ever received. I never showed Mrs. Flukiger my paper. I didn't want to explain that grade. But even so, I regarded it as a badge of honor. Like Nancy, I had descended into the darkness and emerged intact, if slightly bruised. I'd sacrificed my grade and withstood a teacher's disapproval, all to protect the reputation of my beloved librarian. Finally, I'd acted like the heroine in a novel, a so-called junky one, but a novel nevertheless. I had Mrs. Flukiger to thank for that.